Welcome, everyone. So glad to see so many of you. This is a great turnout, and rightfully so, because we have a wonderful guest speaker here today. My name is Keenan. For those who don't know me, I'm on the board of APRA, the Amsterdam Psychedelic Research Association. We organize academic events such as this one, but also social events for people who are interested in psychedelics and their applications in science and therapy. And I'm very excited to be able to introduce our guest speaker for today, Dr. Ruben Laukkonen. We were just talking about that this is probably his third time around at APRA. He's a return guest, but the last time was about 3 years ago, in the middle of COVID times actually, and his previous talks are on our YouTube channel, and I think very much worth revisiting. You'll see a bit of an evolution in his work, probably, and his previous talk was about meditation and the plasticity of the mind, and basically how these special states of consciousness, like meditation, but also the psychedelic states, kind of deconstruct the way that we normally perceive the world. And it's kind of explained through these mechanisms of predictive processing. And one thing that really stuck with me from one of these talks was the phenomenology of aha moments that you discussed back then. That feeling of aha, right? Something's been revealed to you. And the concept that this experience is something that can also just be induced, right? Just like any other emotion or powerful experience induced by meditation or psychedelics. But how true or how authentic are these experiences really? And I think it's not just interesting on a conceptual level, but it also has pretty profound implications, for example, for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, right? Because we so strongly associate these experiences with profound insight or like the revelation of some sort of ultimate reality. But what if it's not really accurate, right? There's this old joke, or maybe it's sound advice, that you shouldn't make any rash life decisions or quit your job until 6 weeks after Burning Man. Sounds like pretty good advice. I think some of the work Ruben has been doing is really some of the most interesting stuff going on in psychedelic research and the cognitive neuroscience in general. So I'm not going to give a very long academic introduction, but I will say that Ruben is a lecturer and researcher at Southern Cross University in Australia. His work covers areas from meditation to cognitive neuroscience and psychology, predictive processing, and of course psychedelic states. And he's also a principal investigator of the largest psychedelic clinical trial in Australia at the moment. We're very glad to have him here, and let's give him a warm round of applause.
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me again. I think I'm relieved that you're not tired of me yet. And that was just a wonderful introduction, and kind of took my punchline away, but that's fine. So I've been obsessed with the experience of insight for, it's hard to believe, it's like 12 years. I started my PhD around 2011 or 12 on insight specifically. And I'm really glad that I can now start to apply this to psychedelics, because that was the context that made me so interested in it. I was fascinated that you could have these profound insights and then suddenly see the world in a new way. And I knew there was something unique about that phenomenon. And I thought if we could understand that, then we might understand how minds change in general. So I've been applying kind of this lens of insight to psychedelics, meditation, but also, really kind of basic cognitive science paradigms. Because back in that time, especially in Australia, there really wasn't this psychedelic renaissance, wasn't at least as hot as it is now. So doing that kind of research wasn't really possible. So you'll see this kind of progression in this talk from really basic cognitive science paradigms into thinking more broadly about psychedelics. And there's a lot of cool stuff still to come. So I hope to come back for a fourth time sometime. So I'll start in part one, just tell you a bit about insight and the history of insight research. Most people don't know that it's an area that's been researched for over 100 years with all sorts of interesting paradigms. Then apply this in the context of psychedelics, think about some of the theoretical work we've been doing, and then get a little bit philosophical and indeed think about, how can we trust these insights that happen on psychedelics? What might be the trade-offs of suddenly inducing a bunch of insights sort of out of nowhere in the human mind? And how might that affect our sort of search for truth and meaning and just the potential for epistemic harm as well. And so I'm really an optimist about all of this kind of stuff, but I think we do need to be aware of the potential downsides. All right, starting with insight. So some of the first research was actually conducted on chimpanzees, surprisingly enough, by the Gestalt psychologist. So this was a book published in the 1920s. And he observed insight in a really unusual way. So what he would do is set up these problems for chimps to solve. And basically they just need to get these bananas. And so there was a lot of motivation to kind of solve the problem. And they'd lay out some tools that might sort of help them get to their solution. And what the researchers observed was that seemingly out of nowhere, the chimps would seem to have an insight, would start stacking these crates on top of each other, and then reach the bananas. And so they observed this kind of non-linearity in these chimpanzees where they would just shuffle around and not have any ideas, and then boom, they'd suddenly get there. They had many of these examples. In one case, again, the bananas were hanging up somewhere they couldn't reach, and there was some poles or sticks, and then they would combine them and actually even kind of pole vault up to get these bananas. So pretty clever solutions. And again, they would arise in this sort of sudden way. And so what researchers have observed is that there seems to be kind of two ways to reach a new understanding, to learn and to discover a solution to a problem. One is kind of gradual in this sort of stepwise linear approach. The other is in this sudden, insightful way. Now, there's something unique here about insight in the sense that it really represents a breakthrough in thinking. Because if you're working on something gradually and gradually reaching a solution, then you're already kind of within a paradigm of what you know. Right? So you're kind of building on your existing knowledge foundations and gradually approaching a solution. But when an insight happens, it seems to represent a kind of paradigm shift in the mind, a kind of restructuring of beliefs. And this is what the Gestalt psychologists call the Gestalt. So your overall kind of perspective actually shifts. And this has a lot of downstream consequences because this is like the foundation of the house shifting as opposed to simply putting on new bricks. So, insight experiences are preceded by restructuring beliefs or associated with these restructuring of fundamental beliefs, allowing us to see something in a kind of new light. It's really the lens through which we see the world. So, for example, it's often illustrated in these ambiguous illusions or bistable images. So when you first look at this image, you likely see a frog. And now I can make you see something completely different, again, without changing the information at all. So you don't need new information in order to have an insight experience. So I can just shift that a little bit, and perhaps you can see that there's also a horse in the same image. I don't even need to rotate it for you to have that insight. The information doesn't need to change for you to see life, reality in a new way. And so the mathematicians have been really interested in insight. A lot of insight experiences in mathematics a lot of progress in mathematics seems to come about through these sudden insight experiences, which is not what you would expect for something so analytic and deeply sort of intellectual. This quote illustrates this. The genesis of mathematical creation is a problem which should intensely interest the psychologist. It is the activity in which the human mind seems to take least from the outside world, in which it acts or seems to act only of itself and on itself, so that in studying the procedure of geometric thought, we may hope to reach what is most essential in man's mind. And so he's really pointing out this fact that these profound insights don't come about through just this sort of knowledge accumulation, the way we might think about learning ordinarily. Instead, it's something about the mind working on itself, sort of shifting its models and trying to find a more accurate representation of reality, and this can lead to these restructuring experiences and insights. And this is also at the heart, actually, of how we elicit insights in the lab. So we actually create problems that intentionally mislead you into false assumptions that you then need to restructure in order to solve. And that's how you get insights in the lab. And you'll hear more about that soon. And so this is really crucial. Insight has a distinct and sometimes powerful phenomenology or feeling. So this has really become the defining characteristic of insight in contemporary work. It used to be restructuring, now it's much more the sort of feeling itself, but really it's both happening at once. And so the feeling is of confidence, truthiness, or this noetic quality, just this sense that the idea or perspective you've arrived at is just self-evidently true. It's often associated with pleasure, satisfaction, happiness, relief. Of course, you can also have negative insights. So you might realize that your partner's been cheating on you, and that's not going to feel good. It's going to have some of these other characteristics, but distinctly displeasurable. They tend to be sudden, surprising, and unpredictable. So metacognitively, we never know when an insight is going to happen. We can't predict them, and we've shown this also in the lab very clearly. And they also come with a sense of drive or readiness to act. So there's this link, if you think about this in the temporal domain, of the restructuring, the feeling, and then this sort of confidence to act on the idea that you've had. Now that I know that this is true, I can do something with it. And so it's worth noting here that insights tend to be true, but they can also be false. And now there's a lot of research that's been done on this. This was the first study, but this has been replicated now probably by a dozen experiments, many of which we've conducted. And here the blue bars are insight solutions, so where participants report having had an insight. The green bars are solutions where they report solving it in this sort of stepwise manner. And what you see across a lot of different problem domains is that insights are more likely on average to be accurate than non-insight solutions. So it's kind of reassuring that feeling of insight does actually map onto accuracy in some way. And you would think that, right? It wouldn't be adaptive at all if our insights were not reliable. But even in really controlled domains, simple puzzles, you get a bunch of false insights. You still get that sort of 10 to 20% of cases where participants say they had an insight experience and it turns out to be false, right? So even in nothing complex, it's not like a complex domain like politics or religion or spirituality or this sort of psychedelic experience, but in like really controlled situations, you're still getting false insights. And we conducted a study called Getting a Grip on Insight, where we actually measured insight experiences using this thing called a dynamometer. And this is a highly sensitive measure of grip strength. And so you can measure this over time, and basically we ask participants to indicate their progress on a problem by squeezing this dynamometer more tightly as they approach the solution. And then if they had an insight experience, just to give it a full strength squeeze, spontaneously and in the moment. Because basically I had this idea that we need to know that it's something about that feeling that predicts the accuracy of responses. But to do that, we really need to capture it as it appears. And we need to try to capture it in the moment, and we need to capture the intensity in some sort of embodied way, as opposed to something that they report afterward, because this can be conflated with confidence and everything they know. And so basically a kind of classic insight experience looks like this in the time series. And so what we ended up finding here is that when we had spikes in the dynamometer, it was much more likely to be associated with the correct solution. But not only that, participants unconsciously or implicitly embodied their insight by squeezing the dynamometer extra tight for more intense insights. Now, we didn't instruct them to do that. They just kind of naturally embodied the intensity of the insight. And that implicit embodiment further predicted the accuracy of their ideas in the experiment. So there really seems to be something about that feeling that does track information in the world and tell us about what might be true or what might be false. Again, reassuring. But now kind of looking at the dark side a little bit, can we also create false insights in the lab? So obviously false insights are happening even in these controlled domains, but we can also look out into the world, right? Not all beliefs are true. Not all insights are true. We have all sorts of contradictory beliefs in the world. So that they're presumably having insights, but they don't all turn out to be true. And you've of course also got delusions and psychotic experiences and schizophrenia and all these kinds of cases that are really kind of basically marked by a series of false insights that deconstructs one's worldview and belief system. So this is work conducted by our PhD student Hilary Grimmer. And we use semantic priming to elicit a false insight. So what happens in this paradigm is basically you prime people with a bunch of associated words. In this case, right, they're all words associated with gardens or gardening. Then we present them with a bunch of anagrams, which is scrambled words. I'm just going to bring your attention to the primed allure, the top one, because this is really the key condition. These are all various controls. And so we present them with this anagram, scrambled word, and the actual answer is in danger in this case. So the true answer is in danger. But because we've primed them with gardening, most people see this anagram as gardener. But that's incorrect, right? Because there's two R's in gardener and there's not two R's in the anagram that we've provided there. But that's what pops out to people. That was the hypothesis, if we prime them to see this particular way. And so indeed what we find is that participants report many more false insights in the primed lure condition than any other condition. So this suggests that, again, in the lab, if we manipulate prior information or prime them, then you can have false insights, right? So your insights are still dependent on what you know. So even if we're having these powerful feelings of truth and so on, it's still somehow dependent on our previous learning. And so if that previous learning is wrong, we're going to have false insights, right? Now, insights can also drive our decisions and actions. So insights are not something that sort of just stay where they are, but they play a role, again, in this sort of temporally extended way. They affect how we act, how we see the world, and so on. And so we wanted to test this. And this is based on work in this paper, The Dark Side of Eureka. And so we basically artificially induced insight experiences and then tried to see if that would make associated information seem true. So if you have an insight experience, does that make you believe stuff that just happens to be in the same sort of presented at the same time, at the same moment as that insight? We did this in a really kind of simple and silly way, and I'm really surprised that it worked. But basically, again, we had an anagram here, is the lightest of all metals, so there's a fact here, right, or a question about a fact, and participants need to solve this anagram in order for the statement to make sense. So the statement doesn't make sense until they've solved this anagram. So the participant solves it. The answer is lithium. And then in some cases, they have an insight experience when they solve this. And so the hypothesis was that this little insight that they have when solving this anagram would spill over into the question and make them more likely to say that this is a true statement, that lithium is in fact the lightest of all metals. That was the hypothesis, right? And indeed, that's exactly what we found. So we had a bunch of participants, and what you can see is that truth ratings are average if there's not an aha moment, which is what you expect, because half of them were false, half of them were true. But when they do have an aha moment, they're much more likely to say that the statement was actually true, regardless of whether it was false or not. So the feeling of insight seems to misattribute or extend out into just whatever happens to be there at that moment. And so then we thought, well, surely this doesn't also work with, important worldviews, things that we really care about, things like free will is an illusion, or it is useless to pursue justice, or our sort of basic worldviews about morality, and so on. But it turns out it does. So we could do exactly the same paradigm, but we apply it to statements about worldviews and beliefs about reality, and it will still bias people to be more likely to believe that they're true in the moment. And we had 4,500 participants across several experiments here, and it worked very consistently. And so you can see here when we had no anagram condition, so even just the presence of the anagram, so something about solving the problem itself, kind of boosted truth ratings, but that's of course could be driven by the insight itself. Then we can see that when participants solve the anagram, you get higher truth ratings when they didn't solve it. So again, pointing to this experience of insight. But the strongest effect was indeed when they experienced an aha moment versus no aha moment in the anagram condition for these worldviews. And even when you have solved anagrams, it's really the aha that seems to be driving shifts in worldviews in these conditions. So this is really recent work. I won't spend much time on this, but this is not published yet, and it was work by honor students Albie and Bryn Lee. But we applied this as kind of a little bit like evil scientists in a marketing situation, just to see, okay, does this apply also in brand preferences? Could this be something that's driving our decisions about what we buy and how we like things? And this time we used what's called a CRA, or a compound remote associate. And so the participant needs to find a word that matches with stick, reading, and service. There's one word that goes with each of these words, and it's going to reveal this sort of brand, this particular brand that we've made up, and we made up a bunch of these and with all sorts of controls. And so the answer in this case, if you haven't got it yet, is lip. So lip reading, lip service, lipstick, and this reveals the brand, which is lip brilliance. And here too, we find that when participants are able to solve these anagrams, and especially when they have aha moments, they tend to rate the brand as more favorable and have higher preferences towards, for example, purchasing that particular product. So worth keeping in mind. All right, let's move on now to psychedelics. So that's a little bit about this general thing of insight, right? So I'm trying to get this across that insight, and I'll mention this a bit further later, is a kind of inference that the mind is making about what might be true. And it seems to be reliable in most cases, but you can see that it's just like anything in the mind, it can go wrong. It can break down given the right circumstances. So we need to, in some sense, have some epistemic humility about our insights, even in really ordinary states of consciousness, and perhaps much more so in the psychedelic context. How are we going with time? Good. So there's a bunch of studies in the psychedelic domain that are looking at insight, and this isn't all of them, but I just want to pull out a few kind of key findings. So psychedelics seem to very clearly increase the quantity of insights that happen compared to ordinary life. They also seem to boost the intensity of the insight, especially these feelings of noeticism, but also everything from insight to kind of really powerful insights, like mystical experiences are much more common on psychedelics. Insights seem to increase with dosage. So you can also see that there's this correlation between how strong your dosage and how many insights you have. And interestingly, these insights are pretty sticky. So people even further down, often actually the insights seem to, the feeling of insight or the belief in one's insights during psychedelics actually seems to increase in time rather than decrease, which is surprising and important, of course. In some studies, we find that 70% of participants say that their psychedelic experience was in the top 10 in their life. So there's really something profoundly, seemingly insightful about the psychedelic state, or at least it's leading to feelings of insight in a pretty profound way. Now, insights are also important in psychedelics for many reasons in terms of the downstream effects. So we see that the feeling of insight is extremely important for therapeutic progress. In fact, I will say, based on some of the review work we're doing right now, that it's likely to be the most important predictor of therapeutic progress in psychedelics. It also predicts changes in beliefs. It predicts the emergence of new ideas in psychedelics. It predicts aberrant salience, so this new kind of unusual attentional movements and the tendency to see things as important that the average person wouldn't see as important, so salience. It's associated with life satisfaction, so psychedelic insights, learning, well-being, psychological flexibility, and also seems to have some kind of negative effect on drug addiction, so the amount of insight. So those are kind of preliminary findings, and there's a whole lot more as well, but these are a few of the key things that seem to come out when it comes to psychedelic insights. So insight seems to be really profoundly important in the psychedelic context. So we need to, I think, invest a lot of thought and resources in understanding this better, and there's much more, of course. And there's been some growing discussion about how to kind of think about insights and to hold the kind of powerful epistemic consequences of these molecules in a kind of safe way. How do we relate to this profound insights that happen on psychedelics, and how do we hold them appropriately? So in this work by Chris Timmerman and others, they say that patients primed to believe that everything they see or feel will be the truth may feel preoccupied by any strange or upsetting revelations they might encounter. At the same time, trusting the inner healing intelligence is a foundational principle in many models of psychedelic therapy. And the frequent experience of patients and therapists alike is that insights received do hold some important realness, at least they feel that way, and are coming from a place of deep knowing. How to hold this space of gentle, agnostic respect for the messages that arise is one of the challenges of psychedelic therapy. So how should therapists deal with the insights that emerge on psychedelics? And what if these insights appear to be dangerous or maladaptive or delusional? And who's to say that that would be the case? And how do we kind of prepare patients to be able to relate to their insights in a way that's kind of safe and useful? So this is important for both in the sort of preparatory phase, but also the integration phase, just as much as it is in the acute experience. So the question obviously arises, why do psychedelics lead to more insight experiences? And so of course there's many possible interpretations for this, and I'm going to present our sort of framework for this. And the rebus model is clearly relevant here. I'm not going to go through the whole theory, and many of you will be familiar with it, but I will take it at just a really high conceptual level, which is a basic insight that I think is kind of undeniable. And that is simply that there's something about the psychedelic state that makes the system more malleable, that makes it more plastic and available for change. And it's this malleability that sets the stage for restructuring beliefs, for looking at reality in a new way, right? So at the most basic level, I think it's fair to say that there's something about psychedelics that makes the mind more malleable in the acute phase, at least, and possibly also post-acutely. All right, let's go into the theoretical ideas now. So we recently published this paper called Insight and the Selection of Ideas, and this is really the basic framework of ideas that I've been working on since the early stages of my PhD a long, long time ago. And I want to describe some of these at the high level as well, because this is understandable at the kind of conceptual level, and then there's all these kind of predictive processing, active inference building blocks in there as well. But that is it's a whole other talk. So I'm kind of presenting this at the highest level. So we present this idea of the Eureka heuristic. And so the Eureka heuristic basically just proposes that we have this stream of conscious awareness that's changing over time, right? This in this moment where we're aware and there's changing a stream of thoughts and perspectives happening. And in that stream, we need to somehow be able to select which perspectives, ideas, and thoughts are likely to be true and worth believing and adopting, right? So if we're having a conversation or you're hearing me speak now, sometimes you're kind of nodding along, oh, that's a good idea, yes, that's insightful, this one's not, I'm going to kind of ignore that. But the same is true for our own mind, right? So you're kind of taking in information from me, but you also have this stream of consciousness where your thoughts are also appearing, from who knows where, and you have to somehow select from this stream. And so we propose that the insight experience is a kind of heuristic that the mind is using in order to kind of highlight which ideas and which perspectives are worth paying attention to and worth holding on to, and which ones are we should kind of discard. And it's a heuristic then because it's a shortcut, right? It's a way of telling what might be true so that we can quickly respond in conversation. If we're running away from a lion in the savannah, we can straight away know that, okay, climbing up the tree is a good idea and turning around and trying to fight is probably not a good idea, right? So the feeling of insight guides us in selecting ideas from our stream of consciousness. And we also propose this idea of the insight fallacy. And so the insight fallacy is this: concluding that an idea or perspective is true solely because it was accompanied by a feeling of insight. So always, any heuristic also comes with the bias, right? And in this case, the bias is that we are kind of inclined to adopt whatever feels true, whatever insight appears in our mind. But that's a fallacy because we know now that feelings of insights can be false. We can even manipulate them in a lab and make them reliably false. And so it is a fallacy to conclude that it's true just because it felt insightful, I think. And so this is an interesting example that I think demonstrates this sort of this fallacy with someone who is very intelligent. So Now, mathematician and Nobel laureate John Nash was asked why he believed that he was being recruited by aliens to save the world. He said that the ideas I had about supernatural beings came to me the same way that my mathematical ideas did, so I took them seriously. That's totally understandable, right? This guy's a genius. He's having these mathematical insights that are, breakthroughs in scientific work. And then suddenly he starts having insights about aliens. And he's like, well, I've been right all this other time, so I must be right again. Completely understandable. He eventually was diagnosed with schizophrenia and became aware that his insights may not have been reliable in this particular case. But it highlights this process, and this process that we are all going through. We don't know what's true within the stream of our own minds, but we do know what feels true, and we tend to just go with that. But that may not always be the best. Excuse me. So very briefly on the kind of predictive processing mechanisms for the real computational nerds out there. So before the insight happens, we propose that there's this unconscious work process, which is also known as fact-free learning or Bayesian reduction. It's kind of like neural pruning. So the system is kind of pruning models that it already has. And in this pruning process of trying to select the best models amongst the possible models, it arrives at a new picture of reality. And this leads to a restructuring in the system. And this results in the content of the insight, that is the idea itself, the kind of thing that's actually appearing in the stream of consciousness, which we propose is an ascending metacognitive prediction error, right? So there's the Bayesian reduction happens. This leads to an ascending prediction error up the levels of the mind, so into conscious awareness. This prediction error is then associated with the feeling of insight if it's inferred to be reliable given prior learning and context. And this is dopaminergic precision weighting within the active inference framework. So this is basically another inference that happens again. So you have this like event happen, then you have this other inference about whether it's likely to be true or not. So you have this ascending prediction error up the neural hierarchy, and then you have another inference about whether it's likely to be true given what you've learned in the past. And this then results in whether it's selected or not. And that's why you get that dopamine hit when the insight seems to be true within the kind of space of your own mind. Yes?
So you're saying the kind of phenomenology of that insight is that dopamine actually kind of releasing and you experiencing that is the insight? Is that
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of it, right? So there's the feeling of insight as a kind of inference about the reliability of this new thing appearing in your mind. And if it's reliable, the system gives you a dopamine hit to say, yes, I'm confident, this feels true, this is good, let's go, like let's act, right? And so we know this also because the feeling of insight seems to be associated with the dopaminergic system. So it's consistent with the kind of neural evidence that we have around insights as well. Fits beautifully within the active inference framework in terms of precision inferences. Really the kind of punchline mechanistically is that insight is this sort of precision inference about the reliability of or likely reliability of an idea appearing in the space of our minds. And that's what kind of drives the selection or drives the heuristic, the insight heuristic. All right, so this is a paper that should be out published soon, but it's still in pre-print form, and it's called The Power of Insight, How Psychedelics Solicit False Beliefs. And so our kind of goal with this paper is to take these ideas that I've just discussed with you, put them in a paper and kind of present this idea of potential epistemic issues with the psychedelic experience. The fact that you're having all of these insights might have some downsides in the form of the emergence of false beliefs. Again, I really do think it's about the power of plasticity and how that's a wonderful thing for changing the mind and eliciting new beliefs, but that by definition, in a way, if you make the system more liberal, more plastic, more false insights are probably going to occur. So we propose 4 stages to this. So you have the kind of pre-psychedelic stage, right, where you have the system has a kind of natural dance between its prior beliefs and new input coming in. So in predictive processing terms, that's your priors versus kind of prediction errors coming in. And there's this natural kind of weighting between, I'm going to discard this belief because it contradicts my own beliefs, and we kind of go through this negotiation process between new information and our existing beliefs. And so the kind of prediction error processing in this process is Bayesian, is kind of rational on average, and allows us to reach all of our beliefs that we now have. And then during the psychedelic state, what happens is these priors technically are kind of flattened. So the belief landscape is relaxed, to put it kind of colloquially. This is the plastic stage. You relax how hard you're holding onto your beliefs. Basically, you believe your beliefs less in the psychedelic state. So what happens naturally if you believe your beliefs less is that you believe new input more. So if you relax your beliefs, therefore new ideas and new things that emerge in the psychedelic experience are going to feel more insightful because you're now letting go of your previous beliefs. So anything new that emerges in the mind is going to seem much more true. And we know that this kind of happens kind of across the board. Even looking at the carpet can feel kind of noetic and amazing, right? So combine that with your own insights. It's the same process happening. You're so open and so relaxed that basically any content that emerges in the mind is more likely to feel true. And so this increases this precision idea. So now new input is afforded more precision, is more we're more open to it, and therefore it enacts changes on our beliefs. And so you have all of these new insights, all of these experiences, and this kind of leads to a new set of beliefs as a consequence of this. Once the system kind of comes back, you've now adopted the new insights that you have, and now they are given higher weighting again because the beliefs kind of find their home. And that's also interesting that indeed, like further down the road, 6 weeks or 6 months, we see that those insights seem to still feel, in some cases, more insightful after the trip. So this is just the basic idea. So a system that is more liberal is less reliant on previous learning. If previous learning is reliable, then the probability of false insights increases. So for the average person, you've learned things about the world through a process of kind of careful deduction. And if your previous learning is at all reliable, then at least if you're going to relax those belief systems, then the likelihood that you're going to have false insights is going to increase as you kind of let those beliefs go. But if you imagine another kind of mind that has a lot of existing kind of, let's say either psychopathologies or false beliefs or beliefs that are unhelpful, in that case, you can imagine that even if the insights are false, just getting out of that current frame is really powerful. And it, of course, doesn't mean that all insights that happen on psychedelic are false. And in fact, just establishing truth in this whole thing is a problem we'll get to in a second. But it does mean that just sort of probabilistically, if your learning is reliable and you get rid of that learning, you're going to have just a lot higher likelihood of false insights. And that might be a perfectly reasonable kind of dice to roll, but it's worth considering. And we have some relatively direct evidence of this. So for example, if you give people psilocybin and you measure their creativity, what you end up finding, you don't need to pay attention to the whole thing, but basically what they end up finding is that creativity doesn't increase, and at least in some cases it seems to decrease. So for example, in convergent creativity. But what you do find is that during psilocybin, it's rated as much more insightful. So the ideas they have seem to be much more insightful, but the actual creativity or value of those ideas seems to actually go down. And so you can see this dissociation between the validity of insights and the quantity of those insights. And in terms of our model, the strongest predictor of increasingly higher feelings of insight changes and changes in long-term novelty were lower levels of within network default mode network functional connectivity acutely. And this was a really strong prediction. So, and I'll explain what that means in a second in terms of our model. So psilocybin decreased the integrity of the default mode network, acute higher order plasticity, which is what we propose, right? There's this sort of plastic moment, which was the strongest predictor of subjective feelings of insight, but not objective performance. So again, this sort of measure of neural kind of openness in terms of the breakdown default mode network activity predicted how insightful the ideas felt, but this did not map onto objective performance. So this is kind of what we predict. Yeah.
To what extent does this depend on or relate to personality traits? Because I could imagine some people have more rigid belief systems in general.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I don't know any work that's looked at that, but I think that's a low-hanging fruit in terms of doing a kind of regression and seeing how these play out in terms of personality. Nice. Yep. Maybe we'll just go behind you quickly.
Yeah, I was thinking about the exact same thing because when you were talking at the start, I was thinking about apophenia and people who are more prone to believe in conspiracy theories.
Yeah, I think this is a really good point. We're doing research around these questions right now in terms of how these insights emerge. What are the kinds of traits that might predict the kinds of insights that lead to things like conspiracies or delusions or so on? I think these are really really nice questions. Yeah, and so and this is a bit less direct, but what you find here as well is that neural synchronization, as neural activity synchronizes during a psychedelic experience, ratings of insightfulness increase, and synchronization is a kind of potentially a proxy of, again, relaxing beliefs, because in order to have rigid beliefs, you need a lot of differentiation in neural activity. So the more the neural activity synchronizes, that's kind of, I think, conceptually a nice proxy for the breakdown in beliefs, or not holding your beliefs as rigidly, and this predicts kind of experiences of insight very nicely. So to kind of bring this together, psychedelics are like adding water to the clay of belief systems. This makes the mind more malleable, but it also threatens the integrity of the system. New forms and insights become available at the likely cost of epistemic fidelity. And again, in many cases, rolling that dice is probably totally worth it, especially if you're suffering from a serious psychopathology. All right, we're doing well. So now we're going to get a little bit more philosophical and think about how this all relates to, what is actually true, right? And so I just want to point to this paper if you're interested in kind of insight, big picture. We conducted this review around insight in meditation, problem solving, psychotherapy, delusions, and psychedelics, right? So it's key in all of these different research contexts, because it's all about how the mind comes to new ways of looking at reality. And this applies in many different domains. But common to all of these domains is this issue of how do we know when we can trust our insights? How do we validate which insights are true or likely to be true or adaptive or maladaptive and so on? So I've proposed to you that insight is a kind of inference. It's a kind of heuristic. It's an inference that the mind is making about what is likely to be true given what we know, and that this is likely to break down in some cases. But what we really have is a kind of multidimensional space, which is about to get more multidimensional. But to begin with, we can have false and maladaptive insights, which you can imagine are kind of the worst kind. We can also, shake up the system, and maybe we might land on adaptive but false insights, right? So you might have, the optimism biases might kind of fit into this framework. And we can shake things up again, and we might end up in true insights that are actually maladaptive. So in some cases, some sorts of beliefs are, don't really serve us very well, even if they're more likely to be true than other beliefs. And the kind of ideal scenario, I suppose, is this nexus of adaptive and true insights. And so the question becomes, or the interesting question for me is, how do we set up the mind to have adaptive and true insights? And we can also make this space significantly more multidimensional. So we can think about falsifiability, which you can see on the y-axis there. We can think about veridicality, so likelihood of being true on the x-axis. And then we can have this other axis here around adaptiveness, so likely to be adaptive. And you can also have insights that feel positive, or negative in terms of red versus yellow, and you can also have intensity. So these will be the smaller circles, and bigger circles are really intense. Okay, so now we're trying to get a more kind of multidimensional picture of the kind of insights that might emerge on psychedelics and otherwise. All right, so the first one here is I am one with the universe. So that feels really positive. That's really quite intense. The likelihood that it's true is something we can't totally verify, but perhaps some would argue that, yeah, there's a good likelihood that that is kind of true. But let's just say that that's kind of in the middle there. We can say it's probably adaptive because we do see that people, when they have these mystical unitive experiences, that seems to be really good for them. And in terms of falsifiability, well, we can't really falsify it, at least where we are currently in the scientific paradigm. It's kind of true and not true at the same time, right? And then there's another idea you might have, and this might not be on psychedelics, but at some point in your life, you might have the insight that I am worthless because of some circumstances that happen. So this is obviously highly maladaptive kind of insight to have. It's probably not true. There's not really anyone I think who's completely worthless, so we can say that it's less likely to be true than not. But it is hard to falsify because it's this overarching belief that you can kind of interpret everything through its lens potentially. So where I've kind of put these in this sort of space is up for interpretation. I'm just kind of illustrating what the space might look like, and I won't go through all of these. But you might have I was abused as a child. Again, it may or may not be adaptive to realize that. It's probably likely to be true if you had this insight, but not always. Certainly, it feels very negative. It's also quite intense. And it is falsifiable, but it may be difficult to falsify if it happened a long time ago. Then you have I am Jesus. That can feel really good, potentially, but it's also, it is falsifiable, that one. So it's very unlikely to be true. It's high in falsifiability, and I'm probably going to say it's maladaptive in the long run because I don't think many people are going to agree with you, and it's probably indicative of some kind of delusional belief structure. Anyway, and so there's this whole space, and you can say I solved a puzzle. So it feels good. It's not a big deal. It's probably pretty adaptive, very likely to be true, and so on. And so you have this space, and psychedelics is eliciting all sorts of insights somewhere sort of in this space. And so the kind of empirical question going forward, I think, is basically nudging quality insights, right? So we don't know what kind of insight we want. We want quality insights. We want things that are good, right? And we don't have a good way of defining that, but we could say adaptive and true. If you don't know this book, it's because it's all about this idea of quality and how we can't kind of actually measure it, but we kind of sense what's good and so on. And so really what we need to try to do is nudge quality insights in this sort of psychedelic situation. So how might we do that? Well, of course, we can use the set, so the kind of mindset that the person is bringing to the psychedelic trip, the setting, the context of the psychedelic trip, the particular drug, the dosage of the drug, education, the particular therapy, integration, and also things like intentions and many other kind of specific components of set and setting. So we have all of these things to work with in order to try to nudge quality insights, to try to get towards that kind of adaptive, true kind of space of insight. And of course, there's a lot of subjectivity involved with this. So, maybe we can also tie them to therapeutic outcomes. Certain kinds of insights are associated with positive therapeutic outcomes. Some are not. And as we kind of empirically find all of that out, then we know which ones we kind of want to nudge towards. And I kind of want to broaden this out again as well now to think about a cartography of insight, as insight is not just something that's just like a thought or idea that emerges in the mind. I think we need to think about this much more generally. So you can have, of course, these kind of content insights, that are ideas or perspectives or memories. But you can also have what I call, this is particularly relevant in meditation, which I call process insights, because you're able to observe a process in the mind in terms of de-reification, deconstruction, and transparency, the ability to kind of recognize the processes of your own mind. That can also be kind of insightful and step out of them. Sometimes it's called decentering in therapeutic circles. You can also have an insight about a state of consciousness, right? You step into a new state, or new qualities of consciousness, dimensions or altered states. Those can be insightful in and of themselves, this discovery of a new kind of way of being in the world. And you can also have transcendent insights. So these are the mystical kind of highly integrative kind of, or in the meditation context, kind of awakening experiences. They can also be highly embodied, procedural or affective and somatic. So the kind that happens, for example, in sport, you can have a kind of really physically driven insight. But I also think what fits in there is energetic insights, right? So energetic releases or new ways of relating to energetic experiences. And again, the question is which insights mediate adaptive change during psychedelics and which insights might cause harm. And so using this multidimensional space and all of these manifold kind of insights that might emerge, we can start to develop a kind of epistemology about the kind of insights that we might want to encourage in the psychedelic experience, and which ones we might want to really hold lightly or maybe encourage kind of reinterpretation in the integration phase, perhaps. So this is something we also propose in that Insight and the Selection of Ideas papers as one way that we can kind of relate to our insights in a healthy way, and we call this meta-awareness and epistemic humility, we could say. So in the stream of our mind, there's the content of the insight. So that could be the novel idea or the novel event, the novel state of consciousness that emerges. Then we have that feeling, right? So we have the content and then we have the feeling, oh, this is true. There's the thing and there's the feeling, oh, this is true. I feel that this is true. But even at a more abstract level, we can also have meta-awareness of the insight, which is, I choose to trust this insight. Right? And we have all of these levels of abstraction unfolding within us. The thing itself, our feelings about that thing, and also our ability to kind of reflect on the whole process itself. In a way, what we're doing right now is this sort of meta-awareness process about insights, or metacognition about insight itself. So we're stepping out of the stream of our consciousness, observing it, and able to then make perhaps more wise choices about insights. So it may be that training this kind of meta-awareness might be helpful in setting the kind of intention or the set for a psychedelic experience or otherwise to relate to our insights appropriately. And so just to conclude, I just want to kind of zoom out even further in terms of our search for truth and meaning. So as we kind of go through life, we're evolved to look for epistemic signal, to look for knowledge, to look for truth. And we're on this sort of path and slowly picking the fruits or foraging for knowledge and information and understanding in the world. And our insights are kind of these like lights that guide us along the way in finding truth and finding meaning and finding what's important. And at some point, as we kind of go through this epistemic foraging approach, we may kind of go off track a little bit and do a bunch of psychedelics, let's say, or take some mushrooms. And that's not necessarily off track, but we might go off the beaten path, let's say. And so what happens there is suddenly you're getting this massive download of profound insights that feel perhaps more true, more meaningful, more intense than anything you've experienced in your ordinary life. They stand out in the kind of space of your conscious experience. And so what might happen here is that you might not be willing to get back on the beaten road, and your insights in everyday life, I kind of worry, might not feel as powerful or important as all those insights that you had on the psychedelics, because the psychedelics, through the mechanisms I've proposed, have made everything feel so powerfully insightful. And so we should consider, I think, how potentially psychedelics and these powerful insights change how we actually relate to our search for information, knowledge, and truth out in the world after the psychedelic trip, because now our mind sees that, well, all the most powerful insights I ever had happened on this drug, so forget kind of all the insights that are happening elsewhere. And if we also realize that these insights are giving us big hits of dopamine and all of that, there might be even something to the idea that there's kind of subtle ways that we get addicted to the pursuit of powerful insight experiences. That's all. Thank you for listening.